All right, so thank you all for being here today. Again, thank you all for this. We have a wonderful turnout, all 53 people. So this is a wonderful turnout. Thank you all for showing up for this. I am very excited to be hosting this. My name is Deborah Trusty. I am a lecturer and director of undergraduate studies at the University of Iowa here in Iowa City. And I am joined today by Dr. Dan Davis of Luther College. I'll introduce him in just a minute. Just a note that this talk is being brought to us thanks to the help of the Archaeological Institute of America. This is specifically the Iowa Societies. If you're not in Iowa, it's okay. We won't hold it against you, but the Iowa Society is becoming more and more active, and if you're in Iowa, we'd love your membership. Otherwise, I'm sure whatever state you are in, they would love your membership. So the Archaeological Institute of America, you can find out more information on www.archaeological.org. But there are lots of benefits to being a member, especially if you are an academic or a practicing archaeologist yourself, or even a student, honestly. All right, so I am joined today by Dr. Dan Davis. He is associate professor and head of the Department of Classics at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. Dr. Davis, in addition to working on various publication projects in marine archaeology, helps direct field work each summer on land at the Roman site of Caesarea in Israel. So please join me in virtually welcoming our speaker, Dr. Davis, and I'll give you control for sharing your screen.
Okay, thanks, Deborah. Appreciate that. Okay, so hi everybody. Thanks for coming out on a what is this? Is this Monday? Yeah, Monday, right? Archaeology Day. My name is so thanks, Deborah. My name is Dan Davis, and I really have a lot of thanks to give to Deborah for inviting me out here, along with Angela Ziskowski at Coe College. And I also want to thank my colleague and good friend Mike Brennan, who can't be here. He and I have been co-authoring tons of articles on all the shipwrecks we're going to discuss tonight, and Mike is happy to pass on his regards to everybody also. Well, let's jump right in. A tale of two late Ottoman shipwrecks near Rhodes. I'll just preface this by saying I am not an expert, and those of you who know me well know that I'm not an expert in Ottoman anything. So this is going to be a tale that involves archaeological sleuthing, trying to figure out what it is we find on the seafloor. So we all love a good mystery. So sit back and let me tell you a tale of a mystery. So for me, it all began in 2009 when I was invited. I was a marine archaeologist then, working on some projects in the Mediterranean, but I was invited to take part in the EV Nautilus deepwater surveys of the Eastern Mediterranean, mostly in the Aegean, but also a little bit outside of the Aegean into the Eastern Mediterranean, and also on the Black Sea side of Turkey. And in 2009, I was just graduating with my doctorate from the University of Texas at Austin. And then when I had my job here at Luther, I continued on with that project up until 2012. And we also did a 2013 project in which we found a few more shipwrecks. That's not going to be a part of this talk today. But really, the story begins with this fellow, Dr. Robert Ballard. The world knows Ballard as the guy who found the Titanic, and I'm sure, and even he has told me that he will go to his grave, and that'll be on his grave, discoverer of the Titanic. What a lot of people don't know is that Dr. Robert Ballard is he's an oceanographer, and he's a highly accomplished oceanographer, in addition to being an explorer. I was in high school when Titanic was found, and that lit the bug for me for underwater exploration. I just really wanted to not just be Ballard, but be Ballard. Nothing wrong with that. In 2009, Ballard got a hold of a research vessel And it became part of a trust that he ran, and it was called the EV Nautilus. It still is. It's still active right now. It's in the Pacific, doing some really good oceanographic work. But the exploration vessel Nautilus was my home for 4 summers, and we used it as an exploration vessel for exploring the bottom of the ocean, the bottom of the sea, in this case, in the Eastern Mediterranean, Aegean and Black Sea. If you're a techno geek like I am, you're right at home. It's filled with some amazing technology. The suite of tools used to discover things at the bottom of the sea include, well, what else can you name it besides Hercules? This remotely operated vehicle that is, by the way, not a submarine, not a submersible where people go in, but just a robot. This is the workhorse of Ballard's research program, bristling with cameras, manipulators for picking things up and putting them in science trays, and then articulating arms for even brushing off wood or picking up really delicate things or even picking up really hard things, but also jets and suctions for moving mud on the bottom of the ocean. And for those of you who know and who have been scuba diving, you know that the world is mostly mud. Mostly mud. Well, Hercules, in addition to being a state-of-the-art tool for underwater exploration, is accompanied by another ROV by the name of Argus. And Argus is a tow sled. So Argus and Hercules work in tandem to explore the bottom of the ocean. So let me just explain very quickly. So imagine the research ship, of course, is floating on the sea, on the surface, and then we let Hercules in the water first, and followed by Argus, and those dangle from the stern, right, the back deck of the research ship on a winch, on a cable. So the cable supplies all the power, and the data gets sent back up to the ship. The purpose behind Argus is to remove the heave of the ship. So imagine you're in a heaving ocean, right? You're going up and down in the waves, and you don't want Hercules to be moving up and down on top of say, an ancient shipwreck, right? So by having Hercules attached to Argus, you decouple the heave of the ship, and only Argus is bouncing up and down. And then Argus is outfitted with a bunch of stadium lights to shine light down onto Hercules. It also has cameras, and with those cameras, the pilots are able to get a completely 360-degree view of Hercules to make sure that the main robot, the most expensive of the two, is not in any danger. When you're exploring big steel shipwrecks or wooden shipwrecks with rigging still in place, you can imagine the dangers of losing one of these remotely operated vehicles. So, you might be thinking, well, hold on, you don't get to get wet? If you're a marine archaeologist, you don't get to get wet? No, sorry, you don't. You get to spend all of your time on the research ship itself. This is where the data comes up and into a control room. And it's in the control room where the magic happens. This is where the robots are controlled, navigated, and troubleshot in case something happens. It's where the video engineers sit and make sure we have a constant HD video feed of high quality, all of which is broadcast actually by satellite all the way back to various campuses in the US and in Europe, where research scientists are encouraged to tune in and give their feedback on things that are being discovered. The archaeologists are encouraged to stay away from the pilots. We're steeped in the humanities, not so much engineering, and so they want us to stay away from the very important, buttons and dials, and for good reason. We sit in the back, and then we give them advice on what they should do. ROV pilot, could you move right? Can you move left? Can you rotate around? Can you come a little higher so we can get a bigger view? Can you zoom in, and so on? So, you might say we're the conductors, but we're not the drivers. So you might be asking yourself, well, why this part of the world? Why did Ballard engage in partnership a bunch of archaeologists to come to this part of the world and explore the bottom of the sea? Well, the answer is pretty simple, and it's pretty ingenious. It was Ballard's idea to come to this particular spot in the Aegean. This is southwest Turkey, or the Southeast Aegean, if you want to use that. So this area is considered by most people who understand maritime technology and sea routes and trade routes that it's a bottleneck. So ships that are leaving the Aegean Sea with all of its different big cities, say in the ancient world or maybe in the medieval period, and they wanted to go anywhere east, such as Egypt or Cyprus or Syria, Lebanon, Israel, they would have to come through here, and usually just through a couple of different channels, one of which is the Strait of Roads, which I'll just use my cursor here to point out. So the island of Rhodes is just a few miles distant from the southwest shore of Turkey. So today Rhodes is Greek, and Turkey is Turkey. And it was thought that with the bottleneck being within depths that are reachable by the robot, we should be able to do a systematic survey and see if there are any shipwrecks. So, if you imagine that 1 or 2 shipwrecks sank every year, a minimum, over the age of antiquity and the medieval period, then you should have, thousands of shipwrecks all over the Mediterranean. Well, we're hoping that in this bottleneck, we would have quite a few. And that turned out to be true. I think the idea was a good one. We focused not so much on the Straits of Rhodes, that body of water that separates, Greek Rhodes from modern Turkey, but really closer to the ancient city of Knidos. Knidos sits at the end of the Dacia Peninsula and is a magnificent site and a very important site also in terms of ancient and medieval history. First of all, it's beautiful. The mountainous topography here is gorgeous. The topography creates, and this natural headland creates actually 2 harbors. One for summer, where you have summer winds that protect the ships within it, and then you have a winter harbor where the winds shift, and now all the ships can go to the other side and be protected. And so both harbors, I'm sure, were buzzing most of the year, probably 7-8 months of the year at least. And being at the end of a headland, it's very easy to find, navigationally speaking. The city itself started in the 4th century BC and quickly grew to become a major trading power, never a military power so much, but a major trading power, with complete with a huge marketplace or agora, lined with columns everywhere you look. And of course, in the modern period, archaeologists are still digging here. They're still finding a lot of really interesting things. It also has, this is a picture of the South Harbor, showing you one of the miniature theaters, or it's actually called an Odeon, that's facing the water. Absolutely gorgeous place to go see. Today, not accessible by road. You have to get here only by boat. So you get a lot of yacht traffic in here. So we thought that this place would serve as a center of gravity for shipping. And in the process, because of the high volume of shipping, many of them likely sank, right? Whether it's a result of storms, collisions, faulty workmanship of the ships themselves, piracy, whatever. We suspected that we would end up finding a lot of shipwrecks holding the kind of products that Knidos produced. And Knidos was famous for many things, but one of them was its wine. It produced I don't want to say a mediocre, but sort of a middling wine that was exported fairly widely in these jars that we call amphoras. Amphora, which just means it's carried on both sides as a two-handled jar. The Canadian amphoras, for those of you unsteeped in ceramic identification, are easy to spot. They have a very distinctive toe, or the very base of the amphora, the pointy toe, has a knob on the end that flares out and then comes to a point. And if you see these, you got a Canadian amphora. It doesn't mean that you can date the Canadian amphora. That's where you have to dig into the archaeological literature to find out, exactly what century that form dates to. So if you find these amphoras on a shipwreck, You can identify the maker. You're going to have to dig a little bit to find the year, but probably not too long. After a while, you get very good at identifying amphoras once you find enough shipwrecks. So over the course of 2009 to 2012, these 4 seasons, we started systematically combing the seabed with our sonars, and then we found a lot of shipwrecks. In fact, we found everything you see here is a shipwreck. Every dot on the map you see here is a shipwreck. The first year, 2009, we found 5 shipwrecks in about 2 weeks. So about one every other day or so. Compared to past surveys I'd been on in other parts of the Aegean, this is a miracle. I'd never found so many shipwrecks at once. And in this case, we have quite a range of dates of shipwrecks. We have, for example, Cnidos B, which is the top right here, dates to the 6th century BC, probably the first half of the 6th century BC. Therefore, it's an archaic wreck. It predates the classical period. Talking about the sort of Greece in the making. It's a very exciting shipwreck that we're currently in the middle of researching. And I'm going to throw out my friend Angela Ziskowski at CO, because she and I are currently working this up for publication. But Cnidos A and Cnidos C, these are late Roman wrecks. We can date them within a century, sometimes a half a century, just based on the style of the amphoras. And there's some modern wrecks in here too. The next year, we found another 5. 2010, we found 5 wrecks. Some of them damaged by trawling, especially the bottom 2 you see here, Cnidos I and Cnidos J, but still fairly intact. 2011, they just kept coming. And in fact, we were worried that we were going to run out of letters to name the wrecks. This is what marine archaeologists do, is they name the wrecks, whatever the local city is, and then A, B, C. Well, after finding 10 more wrecks in 2011, we were up to 20 wrecks. And then the following year, the last year of this particular survey, we found 6, bringing it all the way up to Cnidos Z. We got very lucky. We wanted to find more, and if we had found more, we probably would have named them, I don't know, Cnidos AA, AB, AC. We just started over again. In other words, we should have started with just Roman numerals to begin with, but we had no idea we'd find this many shipwrecks. In addition to these 26 shipwrecks, we found 4 more. Oh, here they all are. We found 4 more to the east of Cnidos, a place called Marmaris, which is really on the Mediterranean coast, but not too far away, about 60 miles away. And here we found 4 more shipwrecks, 3 of which are not very interesting. I should say 2 of which are not very interesting, but we're still trying to study them. There just wasn't much there with them. But 2 that were very interesting, one of which, Marmaris B, also dates to the late Roman period. And then we have Marmaris D, which I'll be talking about a little bit during this talk. As a team of researchers, we're very proud to have a good track record with publishing these ships. So far, we have 6 articles out on various groupings of the shipwrecks. And the latest one is on 5 late Roman wrecks from this data set. And they all date within a very narrow time frame, 6th century to 7th century AD, or CE, if you prefer. And these 5 wrecks are not clustered really tight, but they are within our survey area. And they're all carrying the same kind of amphora, a late Roman amphora type 1, which is a ubiquitous amphora found in this chronological range all over the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. And we, in that latest article in the Journal of Roman Archaeology, we try to make sense of the trading world at the time, and not just where the commodities are being produced and where they're going, but why. Are they helping with army supply, for example? Are they part of an independent trading system? Or maybe some combination of both, or something quite different from those 2 scenarios. So I encourage you to look at for that article in the Journal of Roman Archaeology for 2020. For our talk today, we're going to talk about two wrecks, Knidos Q and Marmaris D. They're up here on the map in front of you. Knidos Q is only found a couple of miles offshore of the Dacha Peninsula, about 6 miles away from Knidos itself. And Marmaris D was found in fairly deep water, about 10 miles offshore of modern day Marmaris. All right, so let's get into it. Knidos Q. 1,300 feet is where we found it, which seems really deep, right? If you're a scuba diver, especially, we can't go this deep in scuba, but it's actually pretty shallow in terms of Hercules capability. Hercules is full ocean rated, so it can work comfortably at 12,000, 14,000 feet deep. So for the oceanographers on board, this is considered to be fairly shallow. So 1,300 feet. We have here a smear of a shipwreck. There's hardly anything to tell you it's a shipwreck. Luckily, we had good sonars to help us find it. Let's zoom in just a little bit. Well, first of all, I have some highlight video I will share with you.
What are we looking at, Emma?
You ready to go in?
I'm hoping that there's sound also for everybody.
Yeah.
We're hearing your sound, but it's good.
Okay.
I thought I saw a handle off to the left on something, but actually, this looks like junk mostly.
I don't know.
Looks like there's a paint roller, a beer can.
That looks like
I don't know, what's that at the center towards the bottom thing?
yeah, and right there. That was,
There looked like a handle off to the left if you want to back off and go over there real quick.
go ahead.
Now, take that. Now, before you leave this guy, zoom in on the handle itself, the one to the lower right.
Okay.
Zoom in on that handle. Get as tight a shot as you can.
Oh.
Now, see the shape of the base, too. Yeah, get a nice shot, and then move forward. Don't worry about where the lasers are. You've already got that. Just get a good. Is that as tight a shot as you can get?
That is.
All right, then we'll take it. Frame grab it. Okay, back up now, and go after the one to the left of it. That one.
The handle to the
Oh,
left.
let me just. Oh, there's another four handle above it. See it? See the other four handle up at the top of the screen in the center?
Yep.
Go after that.
Ready?
No.
Sorry. No?
Stand by.
Sorry.
Yeah. Get lasers on that, and then zoom in.
Yep.
Yep. Try to look at the top of it. There you go. Bam. All right, now zoom in on the handles.
Let me get. Hold on, video.
I think
Yep.
she's got it. Let's just zoom in on those handles.
Go ahead.
Take a really tight shot of the handles. The one
Yeah,
on the
it's
left.
the closest we go.
Okay, that's good. That's really good. We'll grab some still grabs here, but try to move forward. Don't worry about the laser.
I am.
Okay, a little lateral left to get it on it, and down.
What's it?
Is that a four-handled? It looks like a four-handled
Yeah.
because it's not opposite one another. That's a four-handle. So we got a side profile of that. If we can get this shot, a little more. Right there, bang, capture. Not very, pretty nondescript.
Maybe a shard there on
Yeah,
the right.
there is, and then one on the, and there's something sticking out of the mud there. Keep tight, go in tight. Let's just see if we see anything. It's interesting that plate, almost like a shard that's in the shape of a plate. See that? To the right? What, you're just off frame to your right.
Yep.
See that rectangular looking thing at the base of that shard?
Yeah, right
that
there.
Must be just, I think that's just another shard.
Right. So there's some live video that was recorded at the time of the discovery of the shipwreck, and Ballard is there on watch, sort of taking command over everything. He does that. It's his ship. He can do that. But he's done this enough to know that the archaeologists are really keen to figure out dimensions of things. And so you probably saw those two red laser dots, right? Those are spaced exactly 10 centimeters apart. And so with that, we can use that as a metric to measure all of the different artifacts that that fall within the frame, because no matter where they are, they're always 10 centimeters apart. But the other thing that is that often strikes people is, oh wait, this is a shipwreck? Yeah, this is a typical ancient shipwreck. Oftentimes we imagine that there's this wooden wreck with a mast still standing and maybe some rope still hanging around, but that's anything that's older than about 50 years, all of that wood is going to be gone, completely gone. It's eaten away by this underwater goat we call Teredo nivalis, a shipworm. And all of that organic stuff goes right through the throat of that thing. And then they excrete a calcareous shell out the back, and you can see shell casings everywhere, usually when you come upon these sites. Whether it's in deep water or whether it's in really shallow water, doesn't matter. Teredo nivalis are everywhere. And so what you're often left with then is what can't be eaten by these shipworms. And that, of course, are the ceramics, which are practically impenetrable. They'll be here tens of thousands of years from now, and probably even much farther in the future. And if you have, machinery that rusts and maybe turns into, a big shell of rust, those will oftentimes just be lumpy bits of iron on the seabed. Sometimes noble metals like gold and other things like even bronze sometimes will be noticeable, but they degrade. Gold doesn't, but bronze and tin and things like that, they also degrade very, very quickly in seawater. So what we're left here with is a very modest boat. I wouldn't even call it a ship. It's only about, the whole site is only about 15 to 18 feet in length and maximum length. So we're talking about a typical weekend boat on a local lake. It's modest. What's interesting though are the ceramics on board. These these are the upper parts of a tall four-handled jar. And when we started looking at the footage at first, none of us on the ship and none of the research scientists on shore who were tuning in could figure out what they were. These had never been seen before. And it's rare for that to happen. Typically we find amphoras, these very common transport vessels. And we can identify not just that it's an amphora, but we can say, that's 1st century BC Roman, or that's from Knidos in the 4th century BC. With these, we had no idea. And because the site is so heavily degraded, that means that the shipwrecks could date anywhere from, 3000 BC to 100 years ago. And we just had no idea. So we kept looking, we kept measuring. And these are the shots that Ballard's team on that particular watch managed to grab. And so we have not just the four-handled jars, but other kinds of vessels too that are flat-bottomed. Some are bowls, some are two-handled, but they're broken. They're in a high state of breakage because the site was probably trawled by a modern fishing trawl. Where modern fishing boats will drag their nets that are weighted along the seabed, and oftentimes they snag shipwrecks and they break things up pretty badly. And at the same time, they kind of haul all the trash around. All the floating trash tends to get caught up in the wakes of these trawlers. And so you find beer cans and pop bottles and styrofoam, even big sheet plastic floating around. Looks like a big junkyard down there. So anyway, a two-handled, lug-handled bowl, which is very interesting. A can of Ephes right next to it. Who knows how far apart they are in age. And just a few of the other artifacts that are visible on this wreck. So we documented Knidos Q and we moved on. There were other wrecks to find. And frankly, some of them were much more exciting at the time that we were on the ship and finding these shipwrecks. So fast forward, and we find another shipwreck, Marmaris D. And it turns out that this shipwreck has the same kind of pottery on it. Now it's 60 miles away from Knidos Q, but and it's also a very small wreck. But this one although it had been trawled, it had probably only been trawled once. And so most of its ceramic containers were intact. So here you have the main debris field of the ceramics. numbered here because we were keeping an inventory. And here's a close-up of that 4-handled jar. So you saw the very top of one on Kineos Q, but here we have the entire thing. Along with the 2-handled jars and even a jug and some other broken vessels, including probably a deep bowl down here in the lower right. Who knows what this dark thing is? Might be a tile. One of the obvious questions is, well, why didn't we raise anything, right? And the answer to that is, during the entire 4 seasons that we were working on these sites, our permit did not allow us to raise any artifacts. We got our permit through Turkey, and they just were not giving away archaeological permits in those years. And so all we could do was take nice pictures of everything and measure things using the lasers. Here's another one of the 2-handled jars, which I guess you could call an amphora, but we archaeologists typically call it a stirrup jar. And here are some other smaller vessels, including what we call a milk jar in the middle. We'll come back to that here just a little bit later. So here we have two shipwrecks carrying the same kind of pottery. They're very small. All right, who cares? Well, for me being on the team, I needed to figure out when these date to. The challenge was on. We don't like to give up. And so it took me years and years to figure out these very modest shipwrecks, what they date to. And in the meantime, before that discovery was made, I had been sending emails out to a whole flurry, a flurry of emails out to a whole bunch of different experts in ceramics that deal in the Eastern Mediterranean. For example, Penelope Mountjoy was an expert on Bronze Age ceramics at the British School in Athens. I figured she would be able to help us. I suspected these were Bronze Age. That is 3000 to around 1200 BC. I thought that these 2 wrecks were very old. Otherwise, we would know about the pottery. And she had no idea. She was very helpful, but she had never seen anything like these before. We sent the images to Jeremy Rudder, another Bronze Age specialist. He had never seen anything like these before. And so after the Bronze Agers were starting not to pan out and didn't know anything about these, I started thinking, well, maybe people who deal with later periods will know something. I sent it to Andre Opeit, a famous amphora expert from Toronto. He had no idea. I'd never seen anything like them before. Sent them to Parskavi Mika at the effort of underwater archaeology in Greece. She had seen them before, but and there are examples in Greece. That's why I have Crete circled here. Crete actually produced some of these underwater, but she had no idea what they dated to. And eventually, in my email correspondence, I learned that these vessels are being found, and they're being shipped. They're being pulled up from the seabed, and they're being deposited in museums, like at Bodrum in Turkey, at Marmaris Museum, even on Crete, and even on the island of Rhodes. But no one knows when they date to. So you know how it is with serendipity. Stick with it long enough, and maybe something will break through, and some kind of clue will come to light that'll just unlock everything. So I was planning for a vacation, a personal vacation at the end of fieldwork in Israel, and I thought I would go to the island of Rhodes. I've never been there, and I from a historical standpoint, I've just been in love with this island for many, many years, if not decades. It has a vibrant ancient period with lots of temples to go and explore. And there is, of course, a vibrant medieval period with a Crusader history that's very interesting also. And so I was looking around for an Airbnb, trying to figure out which part of the coast I wanted to stay on for a few days, just for some relaxation. And I stumbled upon a little part of Rhodes, about 10 miles south of the main city of Rhodes, called Stegna. And so you know how it is on Google Earth, where you can zoom into the street level. And I thought, well, heck, let's just see what this looks like. So I'm just clicking on Google Earth Pro and going down the coast road. And I come upon this restaurant, which you see here on the right with the blue roof. And I zoomed in, and in the windowsill of this kind of funky looking fountain house from the Ottoman period is one of the 4-handled jars in the window. Like, what are the odds, right? So I'd never seen a 4-handled jar before, except on those 2 shipwrecks. And now here's a broken one being used as a decoration in the windowsill of a restaurant. I thought, Rhodes, it has to be Rhodes. Not only must it be Rhodes, it must be this part of Rhodes. Because otherwise, a piece of broken pottery isn't going to travel from, several dozen miles away on Rhodes to this restaurant. I'm sure it's probably from the local area. So I started doing some digging, and turns out that some of the different museums on the island of Rhodes have an online presence with photos, and I started to find other 4-handled jars. You see those here. It's a little hard to see in this photo, but next to the stone wall is a vase with 4 handles on it. Doesn't look quite like ours, but it has 4. This seems to be a Rhodian feature. At the folk art museum, in the little village nearby, a place called Archaeological, there were other 4-handled jars, but also one of the deep bowls with the two handles on it, just like on the shipwreck. It showed up here, and I thought, we have it. We have it. How lucky can you get? A little further digging, and I found a video on traditional Aegean pottery. It was part of a conference. It was a paper given at a conference in Athens by the French school. And these 2 fellows, Georgos Kyriakopoulos and Vasilis Anastopoulos, were talking about the pottery of Archaeological on YouTube and in Greek. And I was trying to listen hard. My Greek isn't so good. I'm listening hard, and I'm starting to hear interesting things about 4-handled jars. And I thought, wow. And then they showed a slide of virtually every single piece of pottery we had on both of our shipwrecks. Our pottery was made in Archaeological. Probably no surprise given the proximity of the 2 shipwrecks. So here's the southeast coast of Rhodes, where you see Stegna, the beach community. And there's a stream that comes down from the mountain, from the center of the island, that goes through Archaeological and through a nearby burg of Petronas. It's in Petronas where the kilns are located. And as I watched the paper at the French school in Athens, I learned that not only do we know where that kind of pottery came from, the kilns have been studied, the place where they were baked in the first place from the clay in the local stream bed. We have pictures of the kilns. We have pictures not only of the kilns, but of the pottery that came from the kilns. And that, of course, includes our 4-handled jars from both shipwrecks. In this upper left photo, I'm not talking about these tall ones here on the bottom right, but behind them are the 4-handled jars that we find on both Knidos Q and Marmaris D. So thank goodness for those ethnographic studies on these traditional. So you might be asking yourself, well, okay, fine. What's the date? Well, according to these 2, they can date anywhere from about the early 18th century all the way up till the mid 20th century. So now we have our date range, but it's vast, right? It's basically a 250-year or 200-year period. Usually archaeologists like to get it down to at least a quarter century if we possibly can. Then I found this photo from the 1950s of a gift shop in somewhere in Rhodes, probably in Rhodes City, that shows our 4-handled jars in the bottom left, which means that our 2 shipwrecks could date to the 1950s, in which case we don't even have archaeological sites. We have, curiosities, basically modern shipwrecks that are not protected by any sort of archaeological laws. This is a bit of a shock. Doing some further digging, though, into some Greek sources, I learned that there are some diagnostic features that can help narrow the date of our shipwrecks down quite a bit. These jars that are just like the ones on our shipwrecks, they were made in the late 18th to mid 19th century, and then they were resurrected as a form for the modern tourist market in the 1940s and 1950s. That's why we saw them on that photo I just showed you. So they have chances are that they date to the ones on the shipwreck date to the earlier period. So we have about 100-year date range, mid 18th to mid 19th century. Well, in the course of doing research, keep in mind, I'm a Greek and Roman specialist. I'm a classicist. I don't venture far outside my own period, but as a marine archaeologist, we have to figure out what it is we find. And so I started digging, and I learned heaping amounts about the pottery trade, not just the trade in goods like foodstuffs and manufactured goods, but the actual trade in pottery itself, which was alive and vibrant throughout the period we're talking about, 18th and 19th and even early 20th century. People have made maps about where different kinds of shapes have been, where they come from, where they're going, and the kinds of distribution that they enjoyed. Islanders needed pottery, and certain island communities liked certain kinds of pottery. And so ships, boats, sailboats, always sailboats, often were dispatched from these islands where the different potteries were located, and they sailed around different other islands and sold their wares. And Rhodes must have done the same thing with their pottery from Archangelos. So these are just a couple of shots showing pottery being prepared on the docks and on the quayside, waiting for unloading to be transported. Again, in boats before the age of steam, before motors came in. These are purely sailboats. The island of Zakynthos here, for example, has some of these distinctive strap-handled amphoras that were exported widely off the west coast of Greece in the Ionian Sea. Those are lined up here on the dock, getting ready to go. And those deep bowls that some of which we found on Knidos Q and Marmaris D, they're not the exact kind as these, but here we have them all being offloaded from a ship onto a pier on the island of Aegean, just south of Athens. A brisk pottery trade. Probably the most ubiquitous piece of pottery was that produced by this site in the southwest of Greece called Koroni. They generated, for a few hundred years, they generated jars that looked just like this one and exported them all over the western part of Greece, and then all over the Aegean and even beyond into to Egypt and Cyprus. We haven't found any of these shipwrecks. They probably do exist. So all we have are the ethnographic studies done by people, mostly in the 19th and early 20th century, when the kilns were still active. So how are we going to date our shipwrecks? Well, one of the most humble artifacts that we found, this little broken jar on Marmaris D, which is in the bottom center of this photo, broken, tiny. It was actually the most diagnostic. In doing a little bit of digging, I found a book produced by a fellow named Newton, and was published in 1865. And it was about tours through the island of Rhodes in the 1850s, 1852, 1856, roughly. And they produced a lithograph of the inside of a Rhodian house. And on one of the pillars, one of the buttresses of the interior of the house was this jar hanging that looked just like ours. Our handles are broken off ours, but you can see where they were attached. And they would have looped up just like that scene here. This fine example, and the only example that we know of on the island of Rhodes. And we know that this one dates to the 1850s, 1860s. So chances are we have at least one shipwreck, Marmaris D, that dates to the mid-19th century, give or take 20 years. So that was exciting. Finally, we're able to put, and then by extension, because the other wreck had similar pottery on it, we can probably say it dates also to the mid-19th century, perhaps a little bit earlier. Well, you might be asking yourself, well, how can you say that? Well, there are other clues. There are other clues that help us deduce that we're dealing here with 19th century shipwrecks as opposed to 20th century. One of them is the size of the boat. They were small, but they could also be big. And chances are that the data set that we produced at Knidos of the 26 other wrecks, probably one of those is a larger kayak, what we call a kayak, not the same as a road kayak, but a kayak, C-A-I-Q-U-E-S, a Turkish word for a sailing ship that moved between the islands and the mainland in the Aegean Sea, especially run by Ottoman Turks, Muslim merchants and sea captains. What we noticed, though, is that after World War I, these kinds of boats, these kinds of ships were all motorized. And if they didn't have a motor as the main propulsive machinery, then they had other motors on deck for running the capstans for the winches and for raising and lowering the anchors. So you would find some really heavy, even on the smaller boats, odds are good that you would find machinery. And what we find on both of these sites, Knidos Q and Marmaris D, is that they don't have machinery. So just by deduction, we must have something prior to World War I, probably 19th century, right? 1800s. And if we go through some of the archives of these kayaks, people study these kinds of boats, going back in time, as even when photography was starting, we find mid to late 19th century kayaks that had no motors at all, no machinery on board at all. They're purely sail-driven inter-island boats, such as this one. They're typically rigged in there are various rigs, right? There's lateens, there's gaffs. There are, sprit rig vessels, different arrangements of sails. Those are difficult to date, but especially Greek sailors could really operate any kind of rig like that. And here's some others too this is on the island of Aegean also. This one hard to date, unfortunately. So I'm thinking that our boats, Knidos Q and Marmaris D, are something like these small, very modest, but really in the big scheme of things, very important boats for filling out the picture of maritime trade and interaction in the 19th century. A period when the Ottomans were in charge, certainly, of the Aegean, but there was still a resident Greek population that partook in this smaller scale but ubiquitous trade all over the place. Ottoman merchants, Muslim captains and shipowners, they typically did the interregional trade, the larger boats and even ships, and they are the ones who interacted with the French and the English and other of the European nationalities that came into the Mediterranean to take part in trade, especially with the Silk Road trade coming through the Mediterranean. But here we have that low level hum of local commerce. In the process of researching this, I also learned that the area of Lindos, just south of Stegna on the coast, was known for its shipbuilding. Ships is a loose term. We think of big ships, but think of boat yards for wooden boats. So these are boat yards that were used to building vessels that would range from, say, 5 meters or maybe 15, 16 feet, all the way up to 20 to 30 meters in length, almost up to 100 feet in length. They're all gone now, although you can go to Lindos today and visit some of the extinct boat yards. There are little museums dedicated to those down there. odds are fair that our two boats came from this area. So you might be asking yourself, well, where to next? What do we do with this data? We didn't raise anything. So, well, I think I mentioned this before. In our data, we haven't published all of our data. We're on the way to doing that. But one of the interesting sites is called Nautilus E, and it seems to also be one of these small scale boats, probably from the 19th century. This one actually has anchors on board, or three grapnel anchors that must have been on the bow of the boat. I don't know why our two boats from before didn't have their anchors. We could probably explain that somehow. But it could be that this one is another of these 19th century ships, in which case it would be really interesting to go back. And if we had a permit to do a little bit of digging and movement of bottom sediments to see if we could find some of the wood and see what the construction techniques of the boat were, and therefore trace it back to, wood type and maybe even style of ship. That's in the future. It's an expensive proposition. Doing deep water archaeology is expensive. I didn't mention that before, but it just is. These bigger research ships like the Nautilus, they typically operate on $35,000 to about $60,000 per day. Very expensive to operate these ships. And so the funds to do so are difficult to come by. And usually it's only in the National Science Foundation that you find the kind of grants that you need to go off and use these things. And then it's science, not archaeology. So archaeologists have to do a better job of coming up with larger pools of resources in order to purchase ship time to get over here and dig in deep water. We can do it. The technology's there. We've already tried it. And even Hercules can do it. But I think we're still a little ways off before we get there. So I thought I'd end it with that, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was wonderful. I really appreciate it. We do have some questions, and I can field them, or I don't know what you can see in your chat, but I'm more than happy to start off with one from John Dorshuk, who is our state archaeologist. He asks, or he says, "Thanks, Dan, really interesting." And then asks, "I assume shipworms work so fast that a 1950s boat would be long gone?"
Yeah, 1950s, certainly. Yep. Yeah, it only takes a matter of a couple of decades for everything to be gone. Rope, all the wood that's above the mud line. So keep in mind that when ships sink, when they come down, they typically, even the small ones, they'll dig a hole for themselves before they hit the seabed, right? There's a pressure wave that accompanies them, that precedes them. And usually the wave will just create a crater before the ship lands in the crater. And then all the dust and mud and dirt that was kicked up will kind of form a mushroom cloud, and then it'll come and settle back down on it. And so the bottom timbers are typically preserved, but you have to dig into the sediment to get to them, which requires an archaeological permit.
I imagine those are hard to come by without proving that you need some sort of reason for digging to disturbing the area. Yeah,
that's right. They are. Yeah, and they change. It's different from country to country. Some countries it's very easy. Other countries not so easy.
Sure.
So this
would be Greek, right? Because you're off of Rhodes.
Well, in this case, these wrecks are closer to the Turkish coast.
Oh, okay.
So we were working through Turkey to get our imaging permits, but we didn't get archaeological permits for excavation.
Yeah.
Yep.
Dan S says, "Are there any newer forms of technology that allow you to date an object without physically extracting it?"
So unlike anywhere else, I think, on the planet, we're very lucky that the ceramics that we find on these ancient and medieval shipwrecks, and even 19th century shipwrecks now, are easily datable within 25 years. So I don't know of any technology that could, like scan something and somehow get a date kicked back. That's the stuff of fiction. But the style of the pottery which is studied widely because pottery, of course, is made on land. It's deposited on land in other archaeological contexts. And therefore, it's dated from land excavations fairly tightly. When we encounter that kind of pottery on an ancient or medieval shipwreck, or now 19th century, we are able to at least get it, like I said, to within 25 years, sometimes maybe 50 years, half century. In some cases, we can get it down even tighter. Depends on the style of the pottery and how well it's been studied.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love your digital archaeology work with that, with even Google Maps. We have a few more questions. It is 7:00. Are you willing to keep going?
Oh yeah, I'm here for the long haul.
Okay, good. All right. So Katina Lilios, who is an anthro professor here at the University of Iowa, asks, thanks, Dan, for a fascinating lecture. I found it amazing to see modern garbage next to the older materials. If there are beer cans down along with the Ottoman shipwrecks, are there other kinds of garbage that end up there that don't date to the Ottoman period?
That's a good question. It's an excellent question that really no one has ever raised with us before. Typically, what we see is plastics and metal cans that still have the manufacturer's date on them, and those are typically from late 19th and through the entire 20th century. And but what would the form of, say, Ottoman garbage look like from the 1800s, right, or the 1700s? I don't know the answer to that. I suspect it's organic. I suspect it's mostly, wood and textile.
Yeah, I bet ceramics probably are their version of plastics. Yeah.
So you might end up finding, and on some shipwrecks you do find this. You find that amphoras of from the 5th century AD are found on the top of a 5th century B.C. shipwreck, with 1,000 years separating them. And you're like, how in the world did that get here? And it's clearly garbage, or somebody dumping a jar overboard as they're sailing by, not knowing it's going to land right on top of an ancient shipwreck. That does happen. It's fairly rare, but it's been documented.
That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Fred Young says, is it known why some of the amphoras have 4 handles? What is the range of designs for the bases of the vessels? The 4-handled ones were flat. The Canadian were pointed.
Right. So that's really what threw us, is that it was flat bottomed. So people who study Bronze Age ceramics see flat bottoms everywhere. On stirrup jars and other kinds of transport vessels, they mostly have flat bottoms and then some other arrangement of handles, but never 4. And then all of a sudden, in the 6th century BC, maybe even before that, in the 7th century BC, everything switched to pointed bottoms, like the Canadian amphoras we talked about. And then those held sway all the way into the late Roman period. And then you start to get rounded bottoms, and then eventually they go back to flat bottoms by the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. So we like to speculate on why this is, but we don't really know for sure. The pointed toes are probably because the pointed toed amphoras fit more efficiently in the hold of a ship, which is curved, right, like this. And if you have flat bottoms, then you can only make 1 tier of cargo. But if you have a pointed bottom, then you could put out a whole layer, and then you could stick another layer in the interstices between the first layer, and then a 3rd layer, and then a 4th layer. You could really stack those jars that way. But with flat bottom, you can't do that so much. And so flat bottom transport jars are typically associated with smaller cargoes for that reason.
Nice. Suleiman Aslan says, super interesting. I'm Turkish origin here, and I'm just going to say exactly what he said, even though I don't think this is silly at all. He says, my question might be silly, but can these wrecks be stolen? I'm a graduate student at U Iowa.
Oh, no, that's not a silly question whatsoever. We do worry about it, and it is a concern. Off the coast of Turkey, off the coast of France, especially the Mediterranean coast, where you have literally hundreds, if not thousands, of shipwrecks from the Roman period. And off Croatia, there's even been studies done by marine archaeologists these days who have experimented with putting cages over ancient shipwrecks to protect the looting of these shipwrecks by scuba divers. These deep water wrecks By the way, and those are all shallow water, scuba accessible wrecks, because anybody can get a tank and a rowboat and go out to any of these wrecks, but not here, right? We're too deep. So you have to have a big ship with a really good robot to relocate these shipwrecks. So we tend not to worry about these particular ones too much. It's only people who can afford the $40,000 to $50,000 a day to go after artifacts that would never recoup that value.
Yeah. No,
So,
good to hear that
yep.
they're pretty safe.
Yep, pretty safe.
Good. Jeff Emerson says, "Hi, Dan. So great to see you.
Hey,
As
Jeff.
always, inspiring to hear you present again. Have you found these Archaeological four-handled amphoras anywhere else, or have any other researchers reached out with their own finds that would provide a eureka moment and tie other wrecks or land sites to Rhodian trade?"
First, so Jeff's an old student of mine. Thank you, Jeff. It's good to hear from you. And that you're still tuning in, despite my best efforts. No, just kidding. But no, you asked a good question. And the answer is yes, they have been found. So not just on these two wrecks and not just on land and roads. I mentioned earlier that they were found in Crete. They were found on elsewhere on the island of Rhodes. They were found in Bodrum, Turkey. The Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology, a place where I spent a lot of time as a graduate student at Texas A&M, has it's the world's best, literally is the world's biggest and best marine archaeology museum. The shipwrecks on display from the past 60 years of archaeology. It's pretty amazing. And local fishermen tend to collect amphoras because they're trawling, and sometimes they bring them to the museum thinking the museum wants them. And maybe the museum does or doesn't, but they have to be conserved. They're expensive to conserve. You have to get the salts out of the different layers of clay. So it takes a lot of time to desalinate all of these jars. But in any event, at the Bodrum Museum, as I understand it, the resident ceramics expert, Con Schnell, he says that they have 14 of these four-handled jars on hand, and he had some idea that they were from Rhodes, but he didn't have. There's no literature saying that they are, and so that's why we were anxious to get into print. We've already published these two wrecks in the International Journal of Nautical Archaeology, so that other people can start to piece that together.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I wonder if you have those and eventually get to excavate, if you can do like NAA, neutron activation analysis, ceramic petrography, anything like that.
I'm anxious to do that, Deborah, because no one else has done it.
That would be fun, especially if you know the clay source. You're
exactly right.
Yeah.
Hey, and I didn't mention this before, but it's worth mentioning real quick, and that is the kilns at Archangelos on Rhodes were the same kilns used for the tiles on the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul.
Really?
It's because of the quality of the clay.
Oh,
so that pottery production area is fascinating and deserves a lot more study.
Yeah, that's interesting. We have two more questions, and they kind of tie in really well, and I think they'll be good questions to end with as well. So the first one that I want to do is from Kendall Hostetler. She is a University of Iowa undergraduate. She asks, what are some trends in maritime archaeology that you're keeping an eye on in regards to modern and potential future research? What are you excited to see in the next 5+ years?
Sure. And thanks for the question, Kendall. I appreciate that. Nice to meet you. Thanks for tuning in. Trends in the next 5 to 10 years. Right now, the overarching trend is to go deeper, because deep is getting easier, especially with autonomous underwater vehicles doing the surveying. These all of a sudden, deep survey projects are within reach of modest budgets, especially with autonomous underwater vehicle technology. You can buy them off the shelf. They don't take a lot to learn how to operate. They're fairly reliable in their surveying, and then when they surface, you can download the data. Then you get targets, and they make these little suitcase ROVs now. These little remotely operated vehicles that you could lower from a small boat to ground truth the sonar data, to figure out what it is, and then decide, do I want to do something bigger with more money later on? So that's an interesting trend, autonomous underwater vehicle surveys. those are changing the maritime survey landscape in archaeology. Hardly any project these days begins without an AUV doing that important preliminary work. But the laborious task of excavating a shipwreck is still as we say, the sine qua non of archaeology. We still need to do that. We need to dig, use underwater vacuum cleaners, pick up all the little stuff, map everything in, and then catalog all of that data and then publish that data. That's irreplaceable. Absolutely irreplaceable.
It's going to be amazing when that's more accessible than the $60,000 a day that it currently costs. Our last question is going to be a combination of my own question and a question from Dan S. So if a student were to come to you, an undergraduate or a high school student were to come to you and say, wow, I really want to pursue this. This is something that I want to do. I want to be a marine or a maritime archaeologist. What advice would you give them? What would you say to this person? What would you recommend? And are there any experiences out there today, research experiences out there today for undergraduates or high school students?
So the answer to all of that is great. Yes, and yes, and yes. Because just to piggyback on the last question, because the maritime surveys are so accessible now and so within reach of modest budgets, a lot of people can do it. So even non-experts can buy an AUV or lease one and go off and figure out what's on the seabed in their local area. There's a lot more to find. We in the Mediterranean alone, something like 2,000 shipwrecks have been found. 2,000. Right. Only a small percentage of those have been fully excavated and published, but finding them doesn't seem to be the problem. Right. We find them. Now we have to excavate them. Now that requires training. So yes, you have to be a diver. That takes 2 weeks of training. Big deal. But more importantly, you got to be a historian or an archaeologist or an anthropologist. You need to have some expertise in the period of culture you're dealing with in order to make sense of anything you find on the seabed. So oftentimes divers like to think, oh, this is, I'm a diver, therefore it's easy to do archaeology. It's the exact opposite. It's easy to train a diver. It's easy to train an archaeologist to dive. It's a lot easier to do that. But you got to have the brain. You got to have the apparatus that can make sense of what it is you find. And not just say cool, but hey, how does this fit historically and contextually into the larger stream of human knowledge? And how, what contribution does this thing make to humanity if we study it? So otherwise we tend to be treasure hunters. And if there's anything a marine archaeologist doesn't like to be called, it's a treasure hunter. It's a pretty bad term for us.
Or any archaeologist, right?
Yeah, or any archaeologist for that matter. Yep.
Tomb Raider, any of those.
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate this. There's a lot of thank yous in the chat as well. So if you can give me a digital round of applause, everyone. Thank you again for this. Thank you all again. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. See y'all later.